Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tribunate. I'm here today with Patrick Wyman. He is the host of Past Lives and The Tides of History, and the author most recently of Lost Worlds. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, it's super exciting to have you here. I love the podcast that you've done, and this most recent book is phenomenal. It's great. It's been an incredible read. It's dense, but in the best possible way. So, Patrick, if you don't mind, can you tell the audience a little about yourself, some of the work you do, the podcast, and the book?
So I am a trained academic historian. I have a PhD in history, but I have spent my whole career making popular history media. So I did a show on the fall of Rome. I did Tides of History for for 9 years. That actually just wrapped up, and I'm doing Past Lives now. I wrote a book that came out in 2021 called The Verge, and I have been working on Lost Worlds for about the past 5 years. And the impetus for this was really that the story we have of how civilization came into being, like this big grab bag of characteristics, like the state, political hierarchies, cities, the written word, administration, all of these things that we associate with civilization. We have a story about how all that came into being. And it's a story of orderly progress from a kind of a prelapsarian, innocent world in which we're all foragers wandering the planet to one in which we are all subjects of some higher authorities. We are subject to all sorts of restrictions on what we can and can't do. We are living in one place instead of many places, and we are ready to get on the path that eventually leads us to the Industrial Revolution. And what I found as I was engaging with the really incredible archaeological work that's been done over the past couple of decades, just path-breaking stuff in any number of different ways, is that old story doesn't hold anymore. We cannot look at the distant past. I look at the 10,000 year period from the end of the Ice Age to the end of the Bronze Age, about 13,000, about 3,000 years ago. And we can't look at that period anymore and say that this is like an orderly upward march of progress. That when we actually zoom in on any given period within that 10,000 year stretch, it looks a lot more like the historical periods that we're familiar with. You see rises and falls. You see cities falling apart. You see whole societies ripping themselves to pieces. You see groups that try to adapt to a changing climate and fail. You see groups that try and do succeed. And what I wanted to do was to write a book that makes clear how different our story looks now, that makes this fantastic new archaeology accessible to a wider audience, and that asks us some basic questions about what our shared past, this shared resource that we all have in common, can do for us.
Yeah, that's very well put. And I think that the book is fascinating how you do lay all this out and how you do go over what I find really interesting are, the false starts, the dead ends, and how it is the development of civilization was not as linear as we would like to believe. Because I think as moderns, we want it to be linear because it puts us at the top, right? And we're then building to something, even better after us. And we're part of a great chain that is inevitable. But, so before we get into like some of those very interesting points about how history develops in this very, organic, like mirroring evolution type pattern, could you go over, some of the ways that we can know about these civilizations? Because it's actually quite fascinating. This book, a lot of it was so fresh to me because a lot of the science is so fresh.
Yeah, so we are currently living in the midst of the third revolution in archaeological science. So the first revolution in archaeological science was people figuring out that older stuff is below newer stuff, right? Like, so the basically, how do you run an excavation? What is stratigraphy? Like,
Schliemann
really
could have
things.
taken notes, right?
Schliemann could and should have taken notes. It's so funny. Stories about archaeologists from that period. Like I was just doing a thing on a guy called Gebeline Man, who's in the book. He lived about 5,000 years ago in Egypt, and I did not know this until recently. But his mummy was purchased by a guy named Wallace Budge, who was for decades the curator of the Oriental collection at the British Museum. And it just like, I started looking into Wallace Budge and I'm like, this guy was a Tomb Raider, man.
That's the most, that's literally like the laziest writing ever, being named Wallace Budge and having that job. Like,
that's what I was thinking. I'm like, really, like that guy is not,
I can see him so clearly in my head.
Yeah. You're like, that guy's not beating a single charge that anybody levels at him from the 21st century. But yeah, so like that's the first revolution. The second one is radiocarbon dating, which gives us absolute dating for things that happened in the past rather than relative dating, like X happened before Y. But the third one is not one single thing, it's many different things. It is a powerful suite of tools that have been developed over the course of decades and are now with shocking speed becoming kind of de rigueur in archaeology. And the real poster child for this is ancient DNA research. So we can take ancient human remains, ancient animal remains, and we can extract fragmented DNA from those remains. And through DNA, like we can see, things about the people themselves. We can see hair color, eye color. If we have multiple samples from one place, we can see where these people related to each other. Like these two graves in a cemetery, is this father and son buried next to one another, mother and daughter? We can see all those things, but more powerfully, DNA is a record of ancestry. So the number of ancestors any one person has starts to get real big real quick. And we're talking about thousands of ancestors by the time we're 10 generations back. And so every individual's genome is a snapshot of thousands and thousands and thousands of relationships over thousands of years going back in time. So ancient DNA allows us to understand the relationships between people, the relationships between populations. It allows us to track migrations through time and space. If you can see that the people who are living in Russia at this time are descended from the people who lived in Italy at this other time, well, that's a good reason to think there was a migration there. So ancient DNA alone gives us access to 1,000 things that we could never see before in the material record. And that's just one tool. We have isotopic analysis, which looks at trace isotopes mostly in human bone, but that can tell us about things like diet, because isotopes, those different isotopes hitch a ride on the different kinds of food that people eat and enter your system. The bones in different parts of the body remodel at different rates. So if we compare the stable isotopes in dental enamel to the isotopes in the cortical bone of the ribs, well, what you got in your teeth sets in childhood. What you've got in your cortical bone is constantly remodeling over the course of a person's life. So you have different snapshots at different times in a person's life of what they're eating and also where they're living. You can match those isotope ratios to the kinds of landscapes in which people are getting their water, basically. So we've got those tools. We have tools for paleoenvironmental analysis. You've got ice cores from Greenland, stalagmites and stalactites from caves in India. So you're getting portraits of climatic conditions, sometimes over, like the course of decades. So we're not even talking about century by century changes or millennium by millennia changes. We're talking about decade by decade changes in local climate. So all of a sudden, this all happened fast. This all happened in the course of a couple of decades. And the story that we have of how all of these different bodies of evidence fit together into a narrative of how we got from point A to point B, how we got from hunting and gathering to living in a world that is the identifiable direct ancestor of our own today. That old story, that orderly one, just can't hold anymore because it doesn't take account of all of this explosion of new evidence that we've gotten in the past couple of decades.
Yeah, and what, in your opinion, and there's a couple cool set pieces in the book, I guess you could say, but like, what has been the biggest like overturning the apple cart types discovery that has come out of that, in your opinion, where something that be it about diet or be it about the location of a certain tribe or ethnic group, what was the biggest aha moment in your opinion?
I think for me it was the ubiquity of migration in the past. For those of us who have been trained in academia in the past few decades, been trained in history or in archaeology, there's been a real move away from migration as like an explanatory cause of why things change in the record. 100 years ago, 120 years ago or so, like migration was the explanation for everything that you found in the record. Well, and that what we're moving, we're not people, but these kind of like billiard ball like groups that kind of rolled around the map, bumping into one another. And this was the model of migration that held for a long time. And like, yeah, if that's your model of migration, it's not a very good model. It doesn't explain very much. But this kind of soured people, also because of the strong associations between that worldview and the Nazis, who used archaeology for all sorts of nasty things, and not just in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like that we kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater. And all of these new tools, when we put them together, one of the big things they're telling us is that people move a lot. People move individually. They move over the course of their lifetimes. They move from decade to decade. They move as part of their life cycles. Whole groups of people move. That there are patterns to understanding migration. It's far more present than we ever thought it was before. And now, because we have these tools, we can match modern migration theory, which does account for all of these factors and explains how and why people move pretty effectively, to the material record of the distant past. So we can combine our modern understanding of migration, which is much more sophisticated than it was 100 years ago, with these tools to see the exact ways in which ancient people were moving around the landscape. We can see how they were moving generationally. We can see who, not just that people are moving, but who's moving, and even sometimes why. So there's a fantastic case of this that I was told about by an archaeologist who works on this, where there was a group of people who lived in the steppes of Ukraine and Russia about 5,000-ish years ago. And they play a really important role in human history because this group is probably the original speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language, which is the ancestor to, most of what's spoken across Eurasia now. I mean, we're a couple billion people speak Indo-European languages these days. And there is a genetic signal that seems to correlate with early Proto-Indo-European speakers. And what this archaeologist found was two people who were cousins. They were descended from the same grandfather, one of whom was buried in Hungary and the other of whom was buried in southern Siberia. And so these people are related to one another. They're separated by no more than 2 generations, and yet they are buried thousands of miles apart. And that's the kind of insight that we never could have hoped to have before, that gives us some real insight, not just into how people move around, but about like the kind of social structures that allow for that, the kind of cultural norms, the technologies, the subsistence practices that allow people to do that. And not just as kind of members of an amorphous cultural group, but these guys were, they belonged to the same male lineage in a society that highly prized descent along the male line, right? So it's not just that we can see people moving. It's that sometimes we can see why. We can see how they moved. We can see what kinds of kind of cultural imperatives were telling them that it's time to go, or we should go a really long way. It's just every single paper I read, and I read thousands of papers for this book, it felt like there was some new and stunning discovery waiting just around the corner. And what I really hoped to get across as I was writing this was that sense of wonder and awe at the scale of this, and also awe at our ability to kind of get at it, to understand some of these things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more, like, it's the book is kind of balanced on a knife's edge, in my opinion, because like you have so many stories of what I guess you could, for lack of a better word, term failure, but then so many people facing insurmountable odds, and unfortunately they don't always come out on top. But then that's balanced by a lot of very interesting stories of folks making do in situations that we would consider remarkably suboptimal, but persevering, finding a way, and either migrating to a new area or adjusting their lifestyle. Or I'm thinking again of the folks on the Pacific coast of Peru in like a very what we is now viewed as like an incredibly inhospitable area, but that being one of the most densely, for 1,000 years or so, being one of the most densely populated regions on Earth, because they made it work. They mixed fishing with hunting, gathering, and subsistence farming and stuff. So, and that's what I find interesting is, and as someone who focuses on Rome, I'm very guilty of this, of doing history that's winners first, so to speak, because victors write the history. That's a cliche to a point, but it's also pretty true, at least in the ancient world. So what do you see in that value of looking at the folks who maybe, they did thrive for 2,000 or 3,000 years. A culture did actually exist and was fully realized and seemed eternal and self-perpetuating to everyone who lived within it. But then, of course, be it climate crisis, be it famine, be it disease, or an invasion of some sort, it dissipates, right? So what can, in your opinion, we learn from the folks who don't make it out to the other side, the folks who are not the quote unquote winners?
I mean, I think the number one thing is that we should recognize just how many societies, cultural groupings did fail. And it's most of them. The number of societies from the ancient world that we have heard of, that we think of as being the success stories, is a vanishingly small minority. I mean, so Egypt and Mesopotamia, for example, which we tend to think of as kind of the basic examples of civilization, the templates from which everything else derives or against which we compare everything else, like they were extreme outliers. There were not that many places around the world where you could build a dense riverine society that's based around kind of persistent flooding of that floodplain and build a really dense agricultural society on top of it. They're both extreme outliers. They don't follow what we would think of as normal developmental paths. When we look at the rest of the world, it turns out that there's just a tremendous amount of variety. There is no one set path. And when we look at the losers as well as the winners over these long periods of time, we can see that there are a lot of different ways of setting things up. And what we find are there are winners we never knew about before. So one of the examples I use is the Proto-Indo-Europeans. I mean, like, there are billions of people around the world who carry the genetic legacy of these people who lived 5,000 years ago in their veins. I mean, same thing with the Proto-Austronesians, who are the ancestors of most of the people who are currently living in island Southeast Asia and a great many of the people living in Oceania, even as far as Easter Island and Tahiti, that there is this, like... that there is this tendency to focus on the places we know and think that anything that doesn't fit that model must be somehow wrong. And so what I wanted to do was expand the definition of success, first of all, and say, so we're not just looking at cities, monuments, kingdoms, states. Let's look at demographic impact. Let's look at linguistic impact. Let's look at the groups that were at the root of these phenomena and not just like the ones that built pretty buildings that we can still see a few thousand years later. So I wanted to expand the definition of success to start with, but I also wanted to try to make sense of, in the very, very, very big picture, like how long does something have to last for it to be a success? Like, if you make it for 500 years as a living in one particular way in this one particular spot, 500 years is pretty good, If that falls apart and it only looks like a blip in the archaeological record to us after the fact, should we just say, well, that 500 years doesn't really matter that much? Or should we look at it and say, these people were doing something that worked for them? We should try to understand what that was. The fact that it came to an end doesn't mean that we should shove them to the side and say, well, they don't belong in our grand narrative of progress. We should say this was a group that, for whatever reason, that may have had nothing to do with the choices that they actually made, didn't make it, or this city didn't make it. Like, it's not the fault of the people living in this one river valley if a tsunami hits the ocean 20 miles away and you get a tidal wave that sweeps up through the river valley and wipes them out. Like, they didn't make a bad choice. They got unlucky. And there are lots of groups throughout human history that didn't disappear because they made a mistake, because they mismanaged their environment, because there was something broken in their society, but because they weren't in control of the circumstances around them and things happened that they couldn't change, despite trying. And what we find when we dig down into it is that people did try. Even groups that completely fell apart, civilizations that completely fell apart. I've talked about the Indus Valley civilization a fair bit in this book. Like, on the one hand, that's an easy story of failure, right? Like these are this is a lost civilization, lost cities that nobody goes back to after around 4,000 years ago. But the other way of thinking about it is these people survived a generational, I mean, not generational, like a once in a thousand years drought for centuries. They managed to maintain their way of life in the face of circumstances that were completely unfavorable to how they had set up their society previously. So should we focus on the fact that it ends, or on the fact that they tried everything they possibly could, rotating different crops to deal with the drought, trying more pastoralism versus more growing crops because that's less water dependent. Like they tried everything they could think of, and in the end it didn't quite work. But we should still give them credit for having tried. We should still recognize the genius of the solutions that they came up with to a problem that they couldn't hope to comprehend. You know, like you're not 4,000 years ago living in the Indus Valley, you're not going to understand the nature of the 4.2 Ka event and how that leads to changes in atmospheric circulation patterns. Like that's like they're not going to solve that, but they did try. They worked really, really hard. And I think that it's not just the outcome that matters, it's the process as well. And now we are much more capable of seeing what that process was, even if it didn't lead to, you know, everybody in the world knowing the name of the Indus Valley civilization and Mohenjo-Daro still being a place that's inhabited thousands upon thousands of years later.
I'm actually really glad you brought them up, because that was where I really wanted to transition, because your point about there being a kind of very broad spectrum of success, like however we define it, there being so many different ways to be successful, right? And I think that the Indus Valley civilization is a great example of a society that, you know, the social organization there was just so unlike anything that existed at the time, and it was successful over a sustained period of time. Unfortunately, it did disappear, and I'm still a Mohenjo-Daro stan. I don't know how many of us are out there, but you know, I'm one of them. But like, what is that? The presence of, because it does go radically against that linear conception of history. Like, how could a society? And obviously, I'm sure it wasn't perfect. You mentioned that in the skeletal record, there's evidence that men were fed better than women, which means there was probably some patriarchy and misogyny going on. But on the whole, the absence of kings or, you know, priests ruling by divine fiat, from what we can tell, indicates a more egalitarian society than we would expect at the period, and one that kind of just runs counter to that. No, you can't have equality until you've had an industrial revolution, and then you can have liberal democracy, and then you work for the People's Republic of Mohenjo-Daro. But like, so in your opinion, what is the presence of, and there's dozens of different examples, but like, in your opinion, what is the presence of all these different forms of social organization, being it the priest kings of the Fertile Crescent versus, you know, that egalitarian society of Mohenjo-Daro? What does it tell us about, like, you know, this political kind of path to development that we're on, that we were kind of set on by the preservation of certain societies, was not inevitable by any stretch?
Yeah, I think one of the big things I take from all of that is none of this was inevitable, and none of this stuff came as a package. Like, I think there's a really big tendency to treat all of the pieces of that civilization package that I mentioned. So like writing and the state and monument building and urbanization and all of this. There's a tendency to treat all of that as if the individual components are interdependent, and they're just not. You can like, I find examples of societies around the world that meet multiple of those criteria and clearly don't meet others. And so are we really comfortable saying, for example, that the Indus Valley civilization, which we still haven't deciphered the script for, we don't even know if what looks like writing to us actually is a script in the sense that we understand it. I think it probably is, but like, we haven't deciphered it. We haven't found evidence of people ruling this state. So does that mean that it doesn't belong in the civilization bucket with everything else? I don't see how we could possibly hold that up. I mean, like, these people were building some of the most sophisticated water engineering on the planet, enormous urban spaces, probably the most integrated region in the world at the time in terms of the movement of goods and people around it. How would we not say that's a civilization just because they don't have kings? Mm-hmm. And, you know, for a long time, the solution when scholars were looking at the Indus Valley civilization was just to impute the existence of kings as if they must have been there, because to be a civilization, you have to have them. And it turns out, when you look at the records that we have from the Indus Valley civilization, whether it's iconography or the archaeology of the places themselves, how they're laid out, there's just no reason to think that there was one person in charge or a restricted group of people in charge. It just does not match the evidence that we have from these places. But the tendency, the need for there to have been hierarchy, for there to have been someone in charge, is so strong that really, really smart scholars kind of assumed that it was there despite the lack of explicit evidence for it. And I think that there is a lesson in there about the assumptions that we bring to the distant past mm-hmm. and how things must have worked. And so what I try to do in Lost Worlds is disconnect the various pieces of those complexes to say that living in one place, whether that's in a village or in a city or whatever, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your subsistence methods. Like, you can live in one place and be a forager if there are enough resources in your local area to support that. You can be a farmer and never settle down. Like, there's still plenty of slash and burn farmers today in the world, and that's an extremely common pattern in like tropical forest biomes. So, are we going to say that farmers who live in tropical forest biomes where the environment does not really support permanent habitation in a single place and extensive reuse of the same fields, are we going to say that they just never get to advance down any sort of path of progress, that they're just stuck at an earlier developmental stage? Or do we want to say that they found a way of life that works really, really well in that particular area, and there's no reason for them to settle down and build neat, orderly villages and carve out neat, orderly fields? Because, like, are they supposed to do that and ruin their environments just because it makes them hit some criteria for civilization? No, I mean, when we put it that way, it sounds ridiculous, right? But that is kind of the intellectual apparatus that's been brought to bear, that's tried to squeeze the complexity and multiplicity of the distant past into this one track. When we start asking different questions and take a little bit of a step back and say, well, like, why were these people doing things this way? What about doing it this way made sense to them? What did this way of life do for them? What did this method of social organization do for them? Like, then suddenly, when we start to understand these societies on their own terms, we start to understand their developmental trajectory a little bit better. Like, because they were going places, it just wasn't necessarily the places that kind of civilization package says you're supposed to go. That doesn't make their lives any less meaningful. It doesn't make their lives any less illuminating for understanding the world that we live in. Like, those people faced problems that are not altogether dissimilar from the ones that we do. They had answers. Are they answers that work for us? I don't know, but we're not going to know until we can actually ask whether there's some value there. If we just immediately dismiss it, then what are you going to do with it? I mean, like, you mentioned the Andes, and that's a great one where, like, the consistency of major environmental disasters, if you're living along the Pacific coast of South America, in this thin strip of coastal desert between the mountains and the sea, where there's almost no water and almost no rainfall, like, bad things happen there all the time. And yet, this is one of the foundational centers of like, even by whatever definition, civilization that exists across the planet. Like, the environment doesn't have to be good by some objective standard for people to figure out how to make it work and to build extraordinarily dense, complex societies there. Like, and conversely, there are times and places you look at in the archaeological record and you're like, this seems like paradise. How could they not figure it out? And sometimes it's like, well, these groups were fighting each other, or they came in with the wrong ideas about what the landscape could be used for, or, you know, it doesn't do you any good to live next to the most productive offshore current in the world, that's like full of millions upon millions of sardines, if you don't know how to make a fishing net, you know? So in all of these different ways, culture, technology, as well as kind of the imperatives of the environment that you surround yourself with. All of these things matter. I just didn't want to write one of those books that seems to offer like a skeleton key that, like, you know, you put the key in the lock and now everything makes sense forevermore. Those tend to be books that rely on monocausal explanations. I mean, and I have no interest in monocausal explanations. I think whatever single explanation you choose for anything is almost always going to be wrong. So I wanted to make it a little more nuanced. I wanted to let people be people in all of their messiness, and to not try to put them all on this one particular path that had to lead somewhere. I wanted to see just like, what were people doing? And when you let people just be on their own terms, in their own societies, making choices that made sense to them, well, you know, you tend to learn a lot more about people, and you can kind of extrapolate some larger lessons about our human story when you start with the people, rather than starting with the story and then trying to shoehorn the people into it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strongest parts about the book, to be perfectly honest, was I think that something comes through in the way you're writing about, you know, the individuals, you know, whether it's a highly extrapolated individual and you're like just kind of theorizing about their life and what it would have looked like, versus, you know, telling the story based on the scant remains of somebody and like what little scintilla of like their life we can suss out from that. You know, there's an attention to detail, and I really did respect that, you know, throughout the book, the undercurrent continually indicates that you have an understanding that these were people. Like this skeleton, you know, it's a pile of bones now, but that was a person who was just as alive as you or I, had a favorite food, had a favorite song, and, you know, whatever, just had a rich, authentic life that interiority that we can only begin to guess at. And I think that is what made the book so compelling to me, is a lot of the times, and this does sync really well with what you talked about, like the book seeking a monocausal explanation, is that the people are statistics. It's all to advance a grand theory, and it's like if one civilization doesn't fit in, they're excluded because, you know, well, that's only just one civilization. But you know, throughout the book, I did really appreciate the attention and the detail that you gave to the individuals who peopled the past, because, you know, that's something I try to do on my channel is go against that great man theory of history. And I think maybe yours is a little easier because we don't know who the great men were, but also it's important that, like, you know, the Roman peasant, you know, rallying for Tiberius Gracchus had concerns not entirely dissimilar from a peasant farmer in Egypt when the lower and upper kingdoms are reunifying. You know, they want bread, they want to be able to eat, and they want to be able to care for their kids. So I found that super fascinating. When we're talking about how civilizations develop in nonlinear patterns in this strictly defined, like, Whiggish history, so to speak, I think an example that is often, like, overlooked, I think because it's so glaring, is Rome, because, you know, it starts as a monarchy, which, of course it's a monarchy in 753 BCE, right? Everything is. That's natural. That's the natural state of being. And then it becomes a republic, you know, in air quotes. It's not a modern republic, just like Athens wasn't a modern democracy. But, you know, a system that I at least would, if you gave me a choice of Roman Republic or like absolutist monarchy, I'll take the limited rights that come with being in the Republic. And so, like,
you'll take your Comitia Centuriata any day.
Yeah,
like,
and my grain dole too. Like, oh, you know, give me the bread. But yeah, so yeah, I'll take what I can get, exactly. And so, like, that's development. That's viewed as like civilization moving in the quote unquote right direction. But then, lo and behold, you know, come Augustus or Caesar, however you want to define when it starts, we have a military monarchy, a dictatorship, or some ill-defined authoritarian state that is a monarchy in all but name, right? And what do you think about, like, this example being kind of just overlooked by that the folks who do want to do a linear retelling of history?
Yeah, it's something I find really fascinating, because Rome becomes the standard to which we compare everything else without understanding how Rome fits into these broader patterns at all. Like, this was something I found. I was really struck by this because I did a whole bunch of episodes for Tides of History on the earliest stages of the development of the city of Rome. And that read completely differently to me, all of that work. And there's some really extraordinary archaeology that's being done on early Rome right now. There's an archaeologist whose name escapes me at the moment. I feel so bad about this. A younger American woman archaeologist whom I interviewed a couple of years ago, who's drilling core samples in Rome in the same way that you would drill core samples in an ice core, because given the nature of the urban archaeological environment, being able to do kind of a large scale excavation of anywhere, that you're pretty dependent on what public works projects are being done. But you can drill core samples, and then you can do a kind of a vertical archaeology of the city that goes all the way back deep into the Bronze Age, where you're just excavating these tiny little layers from different places. So there's really cool archaeology that's being done on it, but that work read so much differently to me after I had this background in prehistory, because I wasn't inclined to think, what is it about Rome that's special? I was inclined to think, what is it about Rome that's utterly bog standard in comparison to the other cities of central Italy at this point, which is very much the prehistorian's viewpoint, right? If you don't have a written text that's telling you that this place is going to be the center of an empire moving forward, you look at a landscape that's full of city-states that aren't materially that differentiated at all. Like, it's not like you look at an average sample of things you take from a site in Rome in 500 BC and in a Etruscan city in 500 BC and think, these people are living in two different worlds. They must have been speaking different languages. You're thinking, wow, there is a cultural koine that extends all over central Italy that is that's pretty standard. And when you come at Rome from that perspective, you understand both how it fits into its local and regional context a heck of a lot better. You understand those dynamics a lot better. You understand that one of the things that makes Rome special is it's just bigger than any other city in central Italy. Even from a very early date, it's probably twice the size of most of the Etruscan city-states that are around it. So you understand that that's one of the things that makes it special. You understand when we look at the other bits of the evidence, maybe it's a little more open to foreign influence and migration than other places are, which we can see reflected in some of the earliest traditions of the city. You understand that it very easily could have fallen off the map in the early 5th century BC when things were pretty rough after the end of the monarchy. And you understand that the textual records that we have, and this is not that Roman historians haven't done this, but I think the prehistorian's viewpoint really helps here, is that when you're dealing with written records from hundreds of years after the fact, that the people who are compiling those records have reasons for presenting things the way they did. They had their own orderly story that they wanted to tell, and that orderly story does not necessarily match what we see in the archaeology of that period. It doesn't match written sources that are closer in time to that. And so I think it helps us be a little more cognizant of the things the Romans didn't know about their past and the agendas that they had for wanting to present their past in particular ways. And one of the problems that constantly recurs in early Roman archaeology is trying to read the material evidence in light of the written, rather than letting the archaeological evidence speak for itself. And if you come at this from the perspective of all we have is archaeology, you end up in some different places. You end up in, I think, better places as a scholar and as a person who's trying to understand this, because you're not bringing that preconception that we have to read this in light of the written evidence with you. You're coming at it with a fresher pair of eyes. And in that regard, Rome's history looks much longer than even we think it is if we go with that Romulus date. We know that there are people there in the Bronze Age. We know that the city is probably there because there was a ford across the Tiber. That leads us to think that the reason for the city being there has nothing to do with the Capitol line. It has to do with the Forum Boarium. It has to do with the cattle market. And that's a much different way of thinking about early Rome and the stresses, pressures, incentives that people there were dealing with than one that highlights the role of kings or lawmaking, or I mean, and it makes projects like, you know, draining the forum and paving the elevating and paving the forum. It makes projects like that seem a lot more important than the Temple of Capitoline Jupiter. It helps you get in touch with on the ground issues. It helps you, I mean, frankly, get out and touch grass as a scholar, which it was always something I found frustrating when I was in academia. I just like people. And I like being around people, and I like average people. I like talking to Uber drivers and people on the subway, and you know, guys making my bacon, egg, and cheese. If I'm lucky enough to be in a bodega in New York, like I like that. That's the world that I live in. I am much more concerned with the things that people did than what they thought. And like when we come back and look at early Rome with those eyes, the city makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense on its own terms. It makes a lot more sense as a part of central Italy. And it helps us make sense of what really... There actually are some extraordinary things about Rome, and things that become even more extraordinary over time. And this helps us appreciate those extraordinary things even more, rather than thinking, well, they must have been baked in at the beginning through some act of the gods or act of Romulus. We can understand the development of the city over time in ways that I find really productive. I mean, I was just in Rome. It was such an incredible experience to have. But like, I did not look at the city the same way with a prehistorian's eye as I did with a historian's. I spent a lot more time thinking about the landscape. I spent a lot more time thinking about kind of the layered nature of the city. I spent a lot more time thinking about its relationship to the world around it than I think I would have otherwise. And like, and also, you know, coming back to it with this perspective, I thought a lot more about slaves. I thought a lot more about people who weren't there by choice. It helped me view Rome more holistically. And like, I'm going to come back to Rome in my work. Like my plan for my next book, I'm going to write about the Middle Republic and kind of this whole rise of Rome idea. And like, I can tell you for a fact that I'm going to think about this a heck of a lot differently than I would have without having had these experiences of prehistory.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because I forget where I read it, but I remember reading about this, and this was a book that's probably 20 years old when I read it, so did not have near the breakthroughs that we're discussing. But even still, you know, the second revolution of archaeology was underway, and the author says, you know, the fact is, you and I know more about the founding of Rome than Cicero did, for example. But like, Cicero knows more about like what that meant than we ever could. And I think that's the interesting tension between, you know, where we have to be independent of the text, and that can be incredibly hard in Rome, where the textual tradition is comparatively so much richer than really anywhere else in the world. But then, you know, obviously there's a ton of great textual criticism that can illustrate, hey, you know, when Livy recounts these episodes, he's really relitigating things, you know, that happened a century later, and he's just basically putting these guys in costumes to, you know, and giving them different names to relitigate an entirely different political fight. You know, that's all fascinating, and that can be done so well, but it's also like, but Livy was saying something, if that makes sense. Like, and like he, you know, like it's a tough nut to crack. Do you know what I mean? Like, where you try, because like in my opinion, when people like Livy or Plutarch, when they kind of get a little free with, or a little liberal with how they write, I don't think they don't think of themselves as lying, if that makes sense. Like, they think of themselves as like telling the story. Obviously, it doesn't meet our modern standards of what a historian should be doing, but like, to them, it's like no, if you get the vibe right, and like, you're, you know, that's fine. And if I'm Thucydides, I can just make up a speech as long as it, you know, it's the same vibe. It feels like you would have said it. So yeah, it's just this interesting cross section of where we have so much hard empirical data we can look at, and there's obviously immense value to that, but then like, we run up against that hard problem of like, but what did the arrowhead in the grave mean? Do you know what I mean? Like, and so your book, to just kind of like bring it all together, I think what you said about resisting monocausality and not wanting to present a grand theory, so to speak, I felt like your book did the opposite in a good way, in the sense that it unlocked a lot of things to re-free them up to interpretation, if that makes sense. Like it's a good reset.
Yeah, that was really my hope. And I mean, it's hard to talk about the book that I wrote without talking about The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Came out about 3 weeks after I sold this book, and really caused me to have a months long panic attack, because I'm like, well, they just wrote something really good and really cool. What in God's name am I going to do? And so but that was a benefit for me, because I had to think really hard about what story am I actually trying to tell. And that's a book that I love. They focus so much on the human capacity for inventing and reinventing our social arrangements, and how hierarchy is not destined. There are egalitarian ways of setting things up, and that oftentimes people have chosen egalitarian ways of organizing themselves over hierarchical ways. But the problem I had with that book, and this is a minor critique, and it's not really what they were trying to do. You don't want to argue against a book that the authors weren't trying to write, but I guess what I found dissatisfying about it is that if humans have all of this choice in how we set things up, how the heck did we still end up here? You know, like if we didn't have to live in societies with kings at the top, if we didn't have to be subjects of something, if we didn't have to live in cities, if we didn't have to be farmers, why are we? You know, like how did we still end up there? And what I wanted to do was retain the element of choice and agency that's so prevalent in The Dawn of Everything. Be like, because people do make choices. They make choices all the time. Sometimes they're the wrong choices, but they are choices. People do exercise agency. I wanted to retain that, which I think is like, so often we think of people from this period, from the distant past, as just being automata. Yeah. They're just humanoid robots who are operating within the parameters that have been set for them. And that's just not what people are. People are wild cards. Like, I think about this all the time. The first guy to get on the back of a horse, like, that guy did not think he was inventing horseback riding. He did not think he was going to be riding this thing all over the Eurasian steppes, you know, doing some conquests. Like, that guy was probably drunk on fermented mare's milk and was probably trying to impress his friends or impress a girl, or was just having a laugh, got up on the back of the horse, and the horse didn't immediately buck him, right? And you're like, huh, okay, that's interesting, that's fun. But that's not an intentional process of, you know, domestication for use as a riding animal. Like, and farming is the same way. Like, if people didn't wake up one morning and decide we're going to be farmers, they started experimenting with plants. And over the course of thousands of years of experimentation, we ended up with something, with the ancestor of farming societies. And so I wanted to get that playfulness. I wanted to get that contingency and that choice, while still acknowledging that there are factors that have pushed us to the place that we're at now. I mean, I think there are environmental factors. There are factors that have to do with demographics and the densities of populations. Like, people need to be fed, you know? Like, if you've got a whole lot of hungry people, you're going to find a way to feed them before you just let society to collapse. And I think in those kinds of things, we can see that there are, like, we're not making choices on a blank slate. We are being pushed in particular directions, even if we can resist those pushes, even if we can think of alternatives, even if we can roll with those punches, we are still nevertheless being pushed. One of them is, like, people with power like having power and like exercising power. And over many, many thousands of years, people who like to exercise power and are good at it have created institutions that allow them to do that continuously. And, like, those institutions were not a natural development. People made them for reasons that made sense to them. And that's the other element of choice. That's the other element of human agency, is it's not just people exercising their agency to come up with fantastically wonderful egalitarian ways of organizing ourselves. People also exercise their agency to exert control over others, whether they think they have a right to, or they think it's better for those people if they do it. We end up in these places for reasons. And I think, like, I really wanted to try to hit the middle ground there, to be like, we can give people choice, we can give people agency, but at the same time, we did all go from point A to point B. even if the journey was a lot messier, was a lot more up and down, was a lot less predictable than we may have suspected, that did still happen, and we need to acknowledge that that did still happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of the book, and I think if you've listened to 50 odd minutes of the conversation, then you're probably sold already. But again, I think that he summed it up really well, that this is a great book to kind of, I think the biggest fallacy historians or people who are reading history can fall into is like the teleological fallacy of like just assuming that one thing inevitably leads to another, and that the world that we inhabit was, A happened, so B happened, so C happened, and there's no, it's all just like atoms, and there's no free will, so to speak. And this book does a great job of deconstructing that and showing the myriad different pathways that could have existed. And, if you want to be optimistic, that can again. Like, it's nothing. The thing I kept, feeling throughout this book was that, somebody, people have been in much more repressive states than the one I currently find myself in. I am in Texas, but there were people who had it worse off than me. And they persevered, they came out of it, and then everyone is always building the future, and nothing is written. We're gonna decide what comes about, and so it is not the 1984 boot stamping on the human face forever. Like a better world is possible. I think was something I kept thinking throughout the book.
It was really weird for me to be promulgating a kind of an optimistic message, because I'm not by nature an optimistic person. But maybe my definition of optimism differs from other people's, but like, if you look at a situation in which 3/4 of the population of an area is just no longer there after 50 years or so, and either like the people just haven't had children, or there's been literal mass mortality through disease or what have you, or people have had to move away somewhere else because the area just can't support them anymore. One way of looking at that is to say that's a social collapse. And yes, that is 100% a collapse of some kind. The other way of looking at it, and this is where what I think is kind of optimistic, is to be like, there's still 1/4 of those people there. Mm-hmm. Those people are still waking up in the morning. They're trying to take care of their kids. They're trying to find enough food to eat. They are trying to live rich, meaningful lives in ways that make sense to them. And the end is never the end. And I have so little patience for this kind of apocalyptic doomerism, where like even in the worst case scenarios, let's say, 5% of humanity survives some cataclysm. That's still hundreds of millions of people. You should feel good about that. Hundreds of millions of people's good. Like that's I like the don't lose sight of the seeds of the future that are being sown even in the midst of catastrophes. Like there's like, to me, that's optimism. I am long humanity after this. I'm short any particular way of organizing human societies. I am long humanity. I am a believer in humanity. I think whatever bad things have happened before, we've come through them as a species, not individually, not as groups, not as societies, but as a species, we come through them. And I firmly believe that about the future, too.
Well, well said. And I think that the book will, if you read it, you'll come away thinking the same thing. So there will be a link below where you can buy it, and I highly recommend that you pick it up. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm probably gonna take another read at it again because it's great and it's also fresh. So Patrick, thank you again for being with us today. And when that Middle Republic book does drop, I would love to have you back and do this again.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for the wonderful questions. I really appreciate your time.